Chapter 2 Mrs. Claus. Darius used the words that once appeased her. Please, Sophie, let's not argue. He'd do whatever it took to dispel the tension claiming her beautiful face. His own jaw tensed. His heart had stopped as soon as he'd spotted her brushing snow off her coat at the front of the shop. She glared at him now. I've wanted that Sega game since forever. But wants were a nothing. Darius needed his wife. He ached for her to admit her desires, and she had, if only for an instant. Her switch from jealousy to the task at hand came too late to fool him. Her brilliant blue eyes, flashing wrath, however briefly, told Darius there was hope for him. His only mission was to rekindle her caring, and that he'd handle delicately. Apologies didn't fly with Sophie. Repeated attempts to communicate sorrow had fallen flat despite her believing that's what she craved. His tone and timing were never quite right because everything was wrong. Or so she thought. You knew I was after that game, and you sharked me, she continued. Sharked? He asked with a lazy brow lift. But Darius wasn't stupid. Despite having asked the question, yes, he knew Sophie wanted the Tetris game. He'd known everything about his wife at one time. Darius had made knowing her his main focus, ever since meeting the analyst with the amazing white, blonde hair and miraculous drive who'd initially turned him down. Co-workers should not date. The couple had shared that standard, and the mutual obliteration thereof. The pairing of CEO and eager intern had proved to be the sweetest taboo. Sophie couldn't bear to look at him now. She couldn't stand him for a long while before she'd left him, too. Hindsight was colder than the snow piling up outside the shop, and yet she wasn't completely immune to him. Customers buzzed around like elves while Darius ran his lower lip between his teeth. There's nothing underhanded about me getting to Gamer's Grotto first. Unless you followed me, no. He waved the card at Rick, his sleeve inches from Sophie's shoulder. We want the same things. Love, acceptance, and a stimulating exchange had formed their initial bond. Nobody could argue like Sophie. Crossing paths is natural. Unnatural was man and wife, home for the holidays, at separate locations. Worse was Sophie heading to some Fijian paradise to land Ross Q. Morgan, a slobbering moneybags who thrilled at making an impact on other men's wives. Sophie had flown beneath the old goat's radar, chiefly because she paid no attention. Her intense focus and believing the best of others, so long as they weren't related to her, blinded her to much of what went on. Sophie feared sharking, but she was chasing a saw-toothed hammerhead. Just stop trailing me, she said. She pressed her muffler against her neck. Please. Don't you want my company trailing yours? He threw out. Rick pretended he was busy with a customer on the phone. Once this exchange was over, he probably knew Sophie would disappear. Disaster in Fiji and, ultimately, the divorce Darius didn't want would follow. You've been following me, he teased. And turnabout, as I said. Don't bring work into it. This is personal. I thought we'd left personal behind, Darius said. The crowd pressed and he held his ground. Sophie shrugged out from under his arm. She thrust out that pouty lower lip he loved kissing, but affection would get him nowhere. Competition would. Attraction resided in the mind, she'd once said. If he hoped to rekindle Sophie's, first things needed to come first. Their rivalry of ideas was a potent aphrodisiac. He shifted out of her way as if he needed to. Pardon me. A mother and two boys, one wide-eyed and mooning over the glassed-in games, the other snuggled in a baby carrier, crowded Sophie toward the counter. The woman apologized, believing Sophie was put off by the glancing of hard plastic. Darius knew better, even without seeing want shudder through his wife. She had to be dying when a miniature of the mother pushed toward the counter with cheek aglow. Are you collecting or cornering the market? Sophie asked Darius blandly. Neither. She twisted toward the counter and crooked an arm to avoid colliding with the girl's bobbing head. Can you get me another Tetris? She asked Rick. The store owner clicked his tongue while Darius gave his head a discreet shake. I can't promise anything before Christmas. I'll try, though. Rick was trying with his female counterpart, who whipped aside the draped door separating the counter from the storeroom. Darius's cousin, one Sophie had never met, was dressed as a sexy Mrs. Claus in snug red velvet and furred accents to bring attention to the cleavage her mother preferred covered up. Super Potato, in Tokyo. We'll have it. I'll call. Nia winked at Sophie. I've secured that Atari system you wanted. Dari? Sophie hadn't spoken the words, or maybe she had. A mocking waft of his wife's perfume flagged him. The signature sweet pea scent he'd commissioned for Sophie was still her favorite. She hadn't replaced it. Or him. Not yet. Ship the game, he told Nia without explaining who she was to Sophie. Talk of family would only disgust her. Meanwhile, Darius was disgusted with thoughts of Morgan, a roach that would get a Merry Christmas if only Darius's phone would ring. You have the address, Darius said with emphasis. Why, yes, I do, Nia said with a smirk. Sophie fluffed her hair, a sure sign of agitation. Another waft of sweet pea filled his head. How long had it been since he held her? 6 months? 6 months, 4 days, and just as many hours? His eyes closed of their own accord. He sucked in more of what he loved. He'd apologize 1,000 times over if that would fix their marriage. But showing Sophie was better than words. Actions. He hoped she'd take his in proper context, provided he got the chance to act. He willed his smartphone to ring as the brother and sister at the counter scrambled past him. Excuse us, again, the mother said over her sleeping infant. You're fine, Sophie mumbled. She crouched with a smile, only to pop up with a candy cane rattle in her hand. You dropped this. Jingles accompanied her setting the toy inside the bulky carrier, despite Sophie being the bluest of the blue. Add $1,000 to my bill. A finder's fee. Darius told Nia about the Atari game to get his wife off track. Sophie made no mention of his excess, something she used to ride him about. Sweet baby, she sighed. Yes, he agreed. May I give you a lift? The heavy snow would make it harder to find a cab, and he needed his wife to smile, even if she hated him. Is the limo circling the block? Where else would it be? Darius. We can talk Sega games and what you're doing for the holidays, he pressed. Sophie may forget about Fiji if Darius got her in small spaces where they could really talk. Christmas was hell for both of them. I'll help with your fund if I can. You'll invest? Now? Why not? Darius asked, despite her blast of frustrated breath. It was better for Andino Group to dive in than invite Morgan's predatory practices. The thought of that grabby hands anywhere near Sophie was a stake to Darius's already bleeding heart, and his blasted phone refused to ring. Just sign the papers and we're good, she said. I don't need you, and you don't need me. He swallowed as she straightened his collar. I still love you, Fifi. It's Sophie, and love is a drug, Darius, an addiction. Just say no. She brushed his cheek with the lightest kiss. It's over. I'll courier over another. Hold that thought. His phone buzzed and he answered to keep from saying something he'd regret. Merry Christmas, she said, and brushed past him.